we can't stop climate change if we keep driving climate change. And I think that's where the security perspective is crucial in the environmental forums, because it's such a huge driver of environmental degradation and global warming.
Hi everyone, welcome to Think and Resist, conversations about feminism and peace. This podcast is a series that explores how feminism can redefine security and address some of the most pressing challenges of our time. My name is Alison Pitlack, and I work in WILPF's Disarmament Program.
I'm Serene Hamid. I'm in the Women, Peace and Security Program.
I'm Genevieve Riccaboni, and I work in WILPF's Women, Peace and Security Program.
I'm really excited about this episode because it approaches a topic that we are hearing about and experiencing all the time, but we're going to approach it today from a different perspective. I think not many people really realize or think about the environmental impacts of armed conflict, violence, and military activity, or that the burdens that are imposed on people and communities because of climate change and the ecological crisis are being carried in different ways depending on a person's gender. WILPF has been really ramping up its work in this area through research and advocacy and through work at the grassroots level with impacted communities to try and highlight and raise awareness on the links between militarism, military activity, and environmental degradation and their gendered impacts. In WILPF's view, we need to address the environmental impacts of conflict, as well as the issue of conflict over natural resources, which I think again speaks to the importance of the conflict prevention pillar of the WPS agenda that we've been discussing in this podcast series. This episode is going to unpack and explain the interlinkages between the ecological crisis and conflict prevention, and explore what the solutions to these problems look like when you approach them with a feminist root cause analysis. Serene is going to be facilitating the discussion today, but first let's give a warm welcome to our guests, Lina and Doug.
So my name is Lina Hjärtström, and I'm Policy and Advocacy Director at WILPF Sweden. And I'm working with disarmament, women, peace and security, and environmental issues, and more than anything, the connection between them.
Hi, my name's Doug Weir. I'm the Research and Policy Director at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. We're a charity based in the UK, and we study the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts and military activities, undertaking research and advocacy.
So the work that you do, we know that environmental degradation and climate change are playing a really big role in shaping our collective global future. And climate-related disasters are not only getting worse, but are also having some of the most significant impacts on low-income, global south, and or small island nations. And while the threat of armed conflict continues to grow due to the factors that include increased competition between different actors, the attempts to control and privatize water and other natural resources, and also the wide displacement of populations across the globe, climate action thus far has not really met the scale of the challenge that we're facing. So with this as a backdrop, we're wondering if you can talk a bit about what the current situation we're in looks like from where you stand in the work that you do, and what are some of the different ways in which climate change is impacting communities around the world, those that you might be directly working with or that you have experience working on the issues with.
Yeah, I can start off by thinking a bit about what you said, Serene, about the competition between communities and the privatization processes. And I really think that the climate crisis puts a light at the fallacies of a system based on armed competition that we're trying to promote a change to in all the work that we do. Basically, and what I think everybody knows by now is that the communities that have the least power and the least decision making in what we do with the world's resources are also the ones who are carrying the largest risks in everything that climate change and global warming means. Like you said, small island nations that face an existential threat. We've seen for decades the environmental damage that nuclear testing has done to communities. And I mean, that's an issue that goes on for centuries, probably, and especially with too little effort to actually clean that up, and not to mention too little effort to make sure that it doesn't happen again. The world hasn't disarmed its nuclear weapons yet, which is, of course, a huge environmental threat. We're seeing pollution, we're seeing ammunition with lead, we're seeing the fire extinguisher, the foam that contains the PFAS chemicals that's just being left all over the planet and seeping into the groundwaters. So basically, who's being impacted by this are people. That's the very simple answer, and it can be all of us. It will be all of us. This is two-pronged in a way, because we need to see a lot of action to counter climate change, right? But we, maybe even more than that, we need to stop causing it. It's not just something that we put in motion and now it's happening. It's something that humanity is consistently reproducing. We're still burning a lot of fossil fuels and extracting more fossil fuel. And we're not really, we're putting a few percent into solutions, and then the rest is just business as usual. So we need to step up our efforts, but we also need to just stop causing these problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big question. Maybe just try and draw out a couple of themes, I suppose. I think one of them, and which has been of a lot of interest to us, is this interface between environmental degradation, climate change, specifically vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, and armed conflict. And when we look at countries that have in particular suffered decades of instability or conflict, like Iraq or Afghanistan, and which are also on the front lines of climate change in terms of warming and reduced rainfall. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, very considerable increases in warming and also desertification and land degradation. We see that the decades of damage, the direct physical damage caused by the conflict and by the socio-economic conditions associated with the conflict. So, for example, encouraging deforestation as a coping strategy for communities, but also very weak environmental governance due to the impairment of governance generally in the countries due to conflict. That is almost this sort of perfect storm, this perfect blend of a population which is uniquely exposed or vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which has lost the protective role which a healthy environment, healthy ecosystems will provide, and which is also exposed to armed conflict and recurring bouts of armed conflict. And in some respects, it requires this attention on what are these complex systems and complex relationships. And a lot of the time, historically, the kind of discussion and discourse around climate security has been relatively simplistic, insofar as you look at Syria or Darfur and the simplistic media narratives that look, climate change causes conflict. We've been looking at climate security and looking at hard security solutions, looking at the risks to the global north from the influx of climate refugees, for example. And actually what we need to be doing is looking at these sort of root cause analyses of why are people in these vulnerable situations? What can we do about it? And more to the point, how can we ensure that sort of these wider human security issues are actually brought into the climate discourse in a more effective way, which they haven't necessarily been historically. And that's changing a little bit now, but it's, a lot of work needs to be done. And I think really critically what we need to see is this breaking of the silos. It's the constant refrain in all these things, but it is absolutely true. I'd maybe just mention the legal framework stuff, because that's quite a big deal this year. In 2013, the UN's International Law Commission, which advises the UN General Assembly on the progressive development and codification of international law, they picked up the topic, the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. And so the first special rapporteur, Swedish Ambassador Mary Jakobsen, over the last 10 years under her leadership and also under the current special rapporteur, Maija Lehto of Finland, they've come up with like 28 draft principles stretching across the cycle of conflicts. There's updated principles on situations of occupation, which are kind of the first sort of development in occupation law, over 100 years. So it's really interesting, really rich area. And just this week, end of April, the International Law Commission are kind of coming together to finalise these principles, and then they'll be adopted by the UN General Assembly in the autumn. But this is kind of the biggest deal that's happening to the legal framework around conflict in the environment since post-Vietnam back in the 70s. This is since the first Stockholm Conference, or a few years after the first Stockholm Conference. If we as civil society don't engage with this, then it's just going to be like something which lawyers discuss in hypothetical seminars, when actually what it needs to be is kind of a baseline framework for what states should be doing and expected behavior of states in these different temporal phases around armed conflicts.
I'll go a little bit deeper into the question, into what you both already shared, and ask you if you can go a little deeper on how militarism affects the environment. I also wanted to ask, Doug, you mentioned this tendency of a simplistic view of climate, how climate causes conflict. And this is a refrain that we hear often in many, many spaces. And I'm also curious about if you can go, and Lina, if you'd like to jump in there as well, how are the wider climate, like the root causes, how are they being brought into different policy spaces? Do you feel like they're being brought in enough adequately?
So I guess when we think about the military bootprint on the environment, we can look at it in a number of different ways. Right? We can look at the grotesque financing involved to support the massive military footprint globally. We can think of the resources required to create and sustain large militaries. We can look at the amount of land and sea which militaries require for training, given that they are constantly in operation, not just during conflicts, and so their environmental impacts throughout the cycle of armed conflicts. And then we can look at particular issues like hazardous waste from munitions or weapons residues. But then in addition, and what's increasingly coming up the political agenda is around greenhouse gas emissions, and not just carbon in this respect, but also high altitude flights and the impact that emissions up there have, and also some of the other greenhouse gases. But this is an interesting and quite dynamic policy space at the moment, where we're seeing a very rapid sort of transition in the debate around it. I think what's interesting, but also particularly kind of symptomatic of military environment, is that since the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997, there was a general shift to exclude military emissions from the UNFCCC process. Mm-hmm. There are some reporting requirements for military emissions, but generally most militaries don't submit. The data that they provide is very poor. The guidance from the IPCC, which says how they should report their emissions, is pretty inadequate. But this speaks to this kind of wider issues around military and environment, that because there is this sense of military exceptionalism, and you see it a lot in domestic environmental legislation. So here in the UK, the Ministry of Defence is kind of exempt from many of the environmental requirements. And so there's always a sense of environmental exceptionalism that because it's argued that the military needs to do their job, they are somehow a unique industry, then they shouldn't come under the environmental norms or environmental regulation that other sectors should have.
It's not a causal relationship that climate change leads to armed conflict. That's a design that the world's made. We don't have to fight over resources. We could also cooperate. But we have an international system that's based on militarism and nation states in competition with each other for resources some of the time. It's always tricky bringing complex issues into new spaces and to policymakers, not to mention media, and to gain attention. So a lot of the time I understand why we're pursuing a narrative where we're warning that conflict or that climate change leads to conflict, because we want the connection made. I'm also a bit wary about the narrative because we also need to actively promote the idea that armed conflict is never just happening. It's always a decision that somebody makes, often through military spending in a budget year after year after year. And we've been seeing CIPRI, the Peace Research Institute in Stockholm, released its yearly numbers for the world's military expenditures just this week. And these have been going up even during the pandemic. So, I mean, these are decisions that policymakers have been making continuously to spend money on militarism over combating climate change. And this has effects looking to Ukraine now, which I'm doing a lot, and I guess the rest of the world too. One of the things that just crossed my path is that Germany is trying to reduce its coal imports from Russia, which makes a lot of sense, but they're trying to fill that gap with coal imports from Colombia. It's definitely impacting their communities a lot. And like Doug was also saying, this is a very sensitive time in Colombia. I mean, they've had a peace agreement in place for a while, but it's not peaceful in a lot of ways. And these are sensitive environments.
So you both have touched on the fact that climate change is increasingly being discussed in relation to conflict prevention, or it should be. And there is this increased awareness of how environmental shocks are disrupting livelihoods and communities around the world and contributing to unrest or displacement or migration. Climate change is being referred to as a quote unquote risk multiplier or a threat multiplier, which essentially frames this as something that worsens other underlying issues. But I'm wondering if you can go a little deeper in what you think about this sort of framing and what are the implications for this sort of framing?
In one way, it resonates quite well with me because it highlights the interconnectedness of the climate issue with other issues, that it's not acting next to other issues or in parallel. It is interacting with other security threats that people are facing. But then, of course, there are issues with everything, like you mentioned. It deserves maybe to be discussed on its own merits as well, because it's also producing a lot of problems on its own, climate change and global warming. Because there is, of course, a problem with certain actors. Again, we want them to think about climate as an important issue because it can't be neglected if we want to deal with people's actual security problems. So we need the Security Council on board, for instance. And but the way that they are used to dealing with problems is very militarized. They have a starting point in national security, and national security cannot respond to climate change and multiplied risks that gives. So it's also a risk that we get the kind of thinking that Doug was touching upon, where, for instance, climate refugees are dealt with as a security problem, and security problems are handled by putting armed men at a border. And in that way, we're supposed to have handled it. But that makes absolutely no sense in any perspective, really, because it means that people are made into a problem and are being put in harm's way. So the most vulnerable people are again denied safety as refugees are turned down at borders, which is insane all in of its own, but doubly so when considering that militaries are such huge contributors and drivers of climate change due to their emissions and due to the huge amount of materials, minerals, metals, all of those resources that they are consuming, not to mention people and money. So we're literally spending our energy on militaries and war rather than conflict prevention or peace building or preventing further climate change. And that's why it's so important to redefine security. We need to talk about this as a security issue, but we need to talk about security issues as issues of human security and not national security.
It's interesting, the climate security debates. It's been Security Council since 2007, was it? And I think it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier about how do we communicate environmental problems and environmental conflict and environment issues more generally. And it's that problem that these are always complex issues. They're never simple. We're dealing with complex systems, but in order to be able to communicate it, we have to simplify it. And risk multiplier, threat multiplier was a relatively simple way to do so. And a framing and narrative around climate security was quite an effective way of of framing it in the context of a Security Council process and in terms of the foreign policy interests of primarily Western states who were promoting it. Some of the problems are, there was a particular focus around US policy, that if they could frame this as a hard security issue, that would engage the US military, and if the US military were engaged, they would find it easier to persuade the US more generally. I think elsewhere you had a lot of well-funded think tanks who were essentially constantly reinforcing this framing around climate security. Is this just another excuse, another cover for Western interventionism around climate change? What we have been advocating for the last few years, and really wish was an approach that had been taken, would be environment, peace and security as a framing to take forward of a Security Council. And that's more reflective of this more complex nature, and also helps to cover issues like the Safa oil tanker, which has been addressed by the Security Council. Although obviously that's kind of highlighted the limits of the Security Council and what it can do, particularly when there were calls for militarized intervention on this dangerous oil tanker moored off Yemen, with no sort of thought for consideration of the implications for something like that. But it's kind of, highlighted the fact that there are really no hard security solutions. And I think, as Lina was saying, you have to look at the underlying reasons. These climate change risks and impacts on human security, they don't exist in isolation. They're always constant and complex issues. And if we focus very much on hard security responses, that completely ignores all the driving factors below that, which are actually contributing to these problems. And if we're too focused on these, when we're just ignoring the actual solutions to the problems there, which may relate to livelihoods, they might be linked to environmental degradation, maybe linked to land rights, maybe linked to poverty, maybe linked to Western exploitation of resources in these areas, all of these issues, which tend to be the underlying issues which are undermining human security in many of these areas around the world. But if we're just focusing on these top level issues around threat and risk, then it's going to lead to the wrong responses, which are almost a form of maladaptation, I suppose, to climate change.
Letting military organizations respond to these issues, of course, also means that they will be getting the funding to do so. And we also know that militaries and security organizations are generally populated by men. So it leaves a lot more decision power and resources to historically very patriarchal institutions. So it puts the possibilities and the resources to do something and to handle the security problem that climate change is for a lot of people back into the hands of men with guns once again. And I mean, this is something that we've tried in the world for a long time, and it's never worked out well. So we know that we need another approach, or most of us know that we need another approach. Women are not the only ones who are excluded from power within security institutions. You can talk about young people or old people or indigenous groups. It's another aspect of power in this conversation that how we frame the issue also feeds back into who gets to do something about it, who's able to do something about it. What are they going to do? What are they sort of rigged to do as institutions or organizations?
So having the issue of climate in the UN Security Council, I'm curious about what you think, what can actually be done in that space?
Yeah, I think that's been one of the challenges of the enthusiasm of getting onto the Security Council agenda, and it's like, we've got it there now, what do we do? But I think over the last few years it's becoming clearer, and fundamentally it's been initially been about ensuring that data on climate risks was embedded in the reporting to the Security Council and the reporting to states. So when they were looking at conflict risks and conflict trends in the countries under their purview, there was climate data in there. But again, I think what's really, really important is that, as we've discussed, it's not just climate. It's got to be environment in a whole, also socioeconomic conditions and then these other issues that all contribute to human security or human insecurity in these countries. And I think that what we're seeing is, greater attention on wider environmental issues as a result of the sort of focus on climate. But it's not perhaps as explicit or clearly stated because there's still a lot of focus around this climate security framing, which is why this environment, peace and security broader framing would probably be more useful as a conceptual approach. I think beyond collecting data, getting data from the ground into the chamber in New York, helping to inform decisions, beyond that, yeah, it's interesting what else can be done, because there are no hard security solutions to these environmental problems. That's just not how it works. So I think it is extremely important that the Security Council deals and addresses the environment, and it's done so through climate risks. It's done through environmental impact of UN peacekeeping operations, which is good. There's been some discussion around international humanitarian law and legal protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, which we know is incredibly weak, incredibly permissive, and also in the process of being strengthened. But yeah, beyond that, it's interesting. What can they do? How do they respond? And again, coming back to this example of the FSO Safa oil tanker off Yemen, what are the limits of the Security Council's power in what it can do? It's been useful to draw the world's attention and focus on this issue, but dealing with the Safa isn't going to be done by the Security Council. It's going to be done within the UN system and the quiet negotiations behind the scenes between the government of Yemen and the Houthis. But yeah, I suppose it's a useful focus for bringing attention to these environmental issues, but then actually dealing with them needs to be done by somebody else.
It's, of course, but it's very close by to relate this to when we pursued the Women, Peace and Security agenda and made the Security Council pay attention to women and gender as issues that are central to international peace and security. Nobody in the women's or feminist peace movement ever thought that this meant that the Security Council would now be the prime feminists and that they would find the best solutions and they would now push gender equality. Of course not. That's still us doing that work. And in the same way, I'm more than certain that the climate and environmental movements and the grassroots movement, the civil society, will be the ones who present the alternatives and the solutions to how we can organize societies that are sustainable and that can keep peace on Earth and peace with the Earth. So that's we need to keep that in mind, that we're not looking to the Security Council or any other institution to sort of take over, but we need to get them to pay attention, and we need them to maybe acknowledge this question so that we can leverage that in other contexts, like we're doing with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, like others and us sometimes are doing with the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. It needs to be on the agenda so that we can push options that are better than whatever the Security Council, because the Security Council is made up of the most militarized states in the world. I mean, they can't come up with the solutions. We just need to ensure that they're blocking them as little as possible.
As a follow-up, if you could walk us through on this issue of climate migration or climate refugees.
It's been such a huge discussion in my context in Sweden that it used to be possible to get asylum as a climate migrant, and then they removed that option from our legislation just recently. Refugees are always described as a problem for somebody else than the refugees, and this upsets me every time, because nobody should have to flee or to move when they don't want to. And we're seeing both that people move because they can't make a living anymore where they've been located, where they've been living, and also because they're being forcibly removed from sites.
I think one of the issues we have is sort of trying to isolate out this climate signal. And when we talk about climate refugees, it's like, okay, you are a climate refugee. But actually what we see in the real world is these kind of, one of the problems which we see is that the data collection on what is driving people to leave, to migrate internally or be displaced overseas, it's not really collected particularly effectively when it comes to environmental drivers. But actually, when we're looking at trying to find data sets on how many people are shifting from agricultural areas in Iraq to Baghdad, the questionnaires and the data collection which is done at the moment, it doesn't really mention the environment, or the environment might be down the list, it might be fifth or sixth, because it's just one of these compounding factors which is driving movement and displacement. And until we kind of understand these things and have a much better handle on it, it's really difficult to identify policies or actions or call for actions on it within countries.
I wanted to go into a question on defenders of the environment and of human rights, including journalists that document different environmental harms those who are doing that work, we know are oftentimes targets. So would like to hear a little bit about, from the context of the work that you do, what are the different obligations for the international community in addressing this sort of targeting and violence on those the environmental human rights defenders and also journalists who focus on this issue?
I'd say the international community and states have huge obligations to face this issue. And first and foremost, I'd say they have an obligation to do the work themselves, to actually do better climate and environmental policy so that activists don't have to put themselves and their lives on the line to do this. Because there's a reason people have to protest, and it's because not enough's been done. Why do we put the burden of defending natural areas or environments or ecosystems on human rights defenders, environmental rights defenders, and civil society? Then I also want to come back to the issue of arms again. We know that small arms and light weapons are used a lot to threaten and harm and kill human rights defenders and activists, environmental rights defenders. And states, of course, and the international community have the primary responsibility to control arms proliferation and to make sure that it doesn't happen. And they've been really bad at this. We know that in conflict, arms disappear, change hands, and they can be in circulation for decades, modified or repaired. During a lifespan of a gun, it can kill a lot of people. So disarmament is a huge part in protection of environmental and human rights defenders, making sure that they are not facing the same threats. We need stronger legislation, definitely, but we need to change the incentives and make sure that it's not profitable to exploit people and land, and to do it on the expense of the local civil society and activists.
How can we more strategically bring the discussions of military activity and armed conflict into the climate and environment spaces like COP, which I should define as Conference of Parties is what it stands for, and how do we draw attention to the impacts of military activity and a militarism at large on the environment in these kinds of spaces? If you can reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, I could happily jump in there, being a personal bugbear, I think. So it's interesting when we are thinking about this framing around environment, peace and security. Part of it is trying to promote the environment within security fora like the UN Security Council. But at the same time, the flip of that is promoting security issues in environmental fora and environmental processes. And we can look at COP26 or the COP process around climate change, UNFCCC process, which doesn't really talk about conflicts at all. There doesn't really talk about military missions, or is only just starting to maybe think about it. And it's vital we get it on the formal agenda, COP27 and COP28, to actually start seeing process and progress on and pressure on states to reduce their military emissions. But that's kind of historically been excluded for this sense of military exceptionalism, which we kind of discussed earlier, but also because it's seen as too political, which is weird because there are a lot of environmental issues which are quite political, like deforestation and agricultural expansion in the Amazon or whatever. These are political issues. The military doesn't have this, or conflicts don't have this unique space when it comes to politicization.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that we're thinking hard about and often, and how to best pursue this and how to move forward. The image that popped into my mind was when I was in Glasgow at the COP26 conference, and the sponsors for the conference, we had a bank that is also investing in nuclear weapons, and there was this exhibition of a fossil-free submarine that was just casually placed outside of the venue. So the greenwashing that is going on in these spaces, and the private sector was there. I mean, they had monitors and they had mixers and they had wine and they had screens and they had everything. And we barely had chairs or Wi-Fi. I mean, I'm thinking that a lot of the environmental movements haven't been too upset about the military factor because it's been invisible. And now we're pushing to make it visible. And I think that could really help the environmental movements to go further and actually point to the harm that military activities and military organizations are doing to both climate and environment. Like I said before, we can't stop climate change if we keep driving climate change. We need to actually stop driving climate change. And I think that's where the security perspective is crucial in the environmental forums, because it's such a huge driver of environmental degradation and global warming.
Do you feel like right now with the way the different I guess groupings of activists and those concerned on environment and security and military activity and militarism and the whole range of root causes, are they working mostly in silos, or do you feel like there are interconnections being made? Where do you feel like things are at?
I actually feel quite positive about this now. So an example is our work with humanitarian mine action organizations. So I personally have been badgering and having heated discussions with staff from mine action organizations for many years about environmental engagement. And actually over the last couple of years, it's a project we've been doing with Norwegian People's Aid. The tide has changed quite dramatically. There's been a lot of environmental mainstreaming work in the wider humanitarian sector, and the mine action sector is kind of following that. It's also a result of donors being more interested and more engaged on what are the environmental perspectives of the work. But also it comes down to the individuals as well, because mainstreaming change is driven by individuals and organizations essentially. And there are more people who are sensitized to the environment. I think one of the sort of challenges to sort of more effective mobilization at the moment is about messaging and narrative. There's quite a lot of the movement who you kind of throw the kitchen sink at campaigning. You know, this really complex narratives and complex stories around conflict and climate and fossil fuels and economy and capitalism. And we all understand these are the problems, these are the issues we face, but it's very difficult to kind of communicate that. And I think what we need to do as a movement is identify those points where we can actually have an impact on our advocacy. So, this is a long road. We don't need to say everything at once. We can get bite-sized chunks and deal with them along the way.
Yeah, I'm also feeling really good about all the cooperations, collaborations, and just relationships that are being built within movements, across movements all the time. So this is also a very necessary process, I think, of integrating our movements and perspectives to be able to have gender just, climate just peace for all of us. And this is not easy all the time. I mean, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. And it also means that you're going to be confronted with very uncomfortable issues and conversations. And our ability to do that is crucial, I think, for our ability to build peace and to build better communities, which helps us. So it's a give and take in a way, and you need to balance that.
I'm also curious about if both of you can share a little bit on some of the projects that you're working on.
Yes, I think one of the projects we have at the moment, so it's building on what we did at COP26. So that was to try and increase transparency around what governments currently report to the UNFCCC around their military emissions. We crunched all the data on that for the top 65 military spenders and created a website, militaryemissions.org. So you can now go and click on that and see what your country is currently reporting to the UNFCCC.
A couple of colleagues of mine have been doing this amazing project over the last few months, where they have been going into the personal experiences of how conflict and militarism are impacting people. So we've been doing interviews with activists across the world on how militarism impacts them and their environment. So we have interviews from Australia and from Lebanon, from different parts of Sweden, that are just sharing their experiences, and this will provide insight into what security is and a feminist security perspective on how this actually impacts people. It's not about the grand narrative, it's about people and how they're able to live or not. And the other thing that we're doing right now is, of course, engaging with the Stockholm Plus 50 conference. It's a big climate conference initiative hosted by Sweden and Kenya. So we will very practically connect the feminist peace and climate movements. That's kind of a big project for us. So we're hoping to communicate a lot more about that in WILPF Sweden's channels and also in the WILPF International channels.
Well, I was going to actually also ask if there was a way to find the work that you do, whether it's social media handles, or websites, or other ways of following up.
CEOB's handle is at Detox Conflict, and then our military emissions gap project is at mil emissions gap. Our website is ceobs.org. That's ceobs.org.
So the work that WILPF Sweden is doing can be found at IKFF_Sverige for those who will be able to follow in that language. And we'll put it in writing for any other listeners. And you can also find us via the WILPF International sites and just click your way to us, to the WILPF Swedish section.
If there was anything else that either of you would like to leave us with.
There's one term that keeps getting overlooked in all the international forums and discussions all the time, which we keep talking about, the prevention part of conflict. Every pre-conflict period is the period where you could make sure that there's never is a conflict and that the war doesn't break out. And we know that this is much more resource effective. It's cheaper to prevent a conflict than to fight a war or to remedy every damage that it's done. And I'm sure that these conversations are happening in the climate movement, probably a lot. But it's also something that's getting too little attention in both discussions around the climate and environment and in peace and security discussions. I just wanted to put some attention to the prevention part because it's always overlooked and underfunded, and it's still the most important thing that we need to do.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for taking the time to talk through some of the ways that decision makers can act to protect the environment and prevent conflicts. And thank you to our listeners for spending time with us. Please subscribe, rate, like, and review wherever you get your podcasts.